The people from other countries who go to these international conferences seem to be envious of America's high standard of living and private property. In 1996, at the UN Habitat Conference in Istanbul, Turkey, the consensus decided that the United States should provide housing for people all over the world. And at the UN World Hunger Conference in Rome, the consensus decided that America should take on the task of feeding the whole world. Now, President Clinton is planning on going to a world conference in Kyoto, Japan. It is widely predicted that the consensus in Kyoto will bind us to reduce U.S. energy consumption by 1/4, and that would have a devastating effect on America's standard of living and on the ability of U.S. wage earners to support their families.
Senator Chuck Hagel co-sponsored a Senate resolution denouncing Clinton administration plans to sign the controversial global warming treaty. His resolution gained near unanimous support.
There are essentially 5 major problems with the global warming treaty as it is now being conceived and probably presented. One, there's no clear, concise science that shows that the globe is warming up. At best, the science is contradictory, it's inconclusive, it's unclear. Second, the economic consequences. The economic consequences, we know for sure, would be disastrous, would be devastating to this country, driving industries out of this country. We would lose millions of jobs. Energy costs would go up. Productivity would go down. Standard of living would go down. Third, if in fact you want to curb greenhouse gas emissions, you certainly don't do that by binding the developed nations and let all the other countries, 130 of the so-called non-developed countries, including China, India, Mexico, South Korea, and others, off, because they will be, within 10 to 15 years, the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. Fourth, national sovereignty. This cuts right at the heart of national sovereignty of the United States of America. We, in essence, if we signed this treaty, would be saying we would allow an international body to come in and dictate to our industries, our businesses, our people, what they could do and what they couldn't do. Use of what energy, which sources of energy, the cost of energy. And fifth, national security implications. If this treaty was signed, it would have disastrous implications on our national security. It would mean that we would have to fly less. We would shut down many of our training programs for tanks, armored vehicles, for ships, and for what? To sign this treaty.
But the Global Warming Conference in Kyoto, Japan, is only the latest in a long line of United Nations conferences. In September 1995, the United Nations Conference on Women gathered in Beijing, China. Kathy Adams attended.
In Beijing, the agenda was very radical feminism. It was homosexual rights. It was abortion on demand.
News reports from Beijing showed women from many different countries singing and holding hands. Viewers were led to believe that these women came together to represent their countries on women's issues. According to Washington Times correspondent George Archibald, that was not the case.
So a lot of these people who participated are already beneficiaries of UN programs, and many of them are getting grants through the United Nations. So they're basically paid functionaries, grant recipients of the UN. So then the UN staff can basically tell these people what they want them to do. And if they don't do what they want them to do, the implicit point is that it's going to affect their funding. When they were promoting the idea that the definition of family should include same-sex partners, men and men, women and women, and a delegate from Honduras and another from Guatemala vigorously objected to this, along with the Vatican. Now, they were taken aside and told, your aid, your programs are going to, you're threatening the funding for your programs if you continue to take this position.
The consensus process was so firmly planted before the meeting even began that the opening day of the conference, there was consensus formed. That tells me that the United Nations is not a place for open debate. It is not a place for people to share different ideas and for freedom to reign. It is a place instead where the United Nations has an agenda, and they have set the agenda beforehand, and people come to the table in order to find out what their working orders, what their marching orders are, and then they are to go back home and implement what the UN's agenda is.
Who directed the consensus on women's and family issues?
I mean, I shot this picture of Bella Abzug as she came to the opening ceremony in Beijing. My own description of her is that she was the Empress of Beijing. In the New York preparatory conferences prior to the conference in China, she was very visible on the floor of the General Assembly when they had the prep meetings, orchestrating action on the the various sections of the draft agenda that was going to be considered in Beijing. I mean, she had privileged access. Regular run-of-the-mill private citizen Americans could never have gotten access that Bella Abzug had. And she was like a symphony conductor, just orchestrating the whole thing.
All the UN bureaucrats not only know Bella Abzug, but they defer to her, they speak of her with respect, they recognize her when she's in the audience, and they invite her to be involved in their meetings and conferences. Bella Abzug is one of the driving intellectual forces in shaping the UN agenda. And of course, her agenda is always what it has been. She was frank enough about it when she was in Congress. She is in favor of destroying the foundations of American society and family life and destroying the foundations of the American economy and replacing it with socialism.
When the American delegation returned to the United States, Madeleine Albright announced that Beijing had produced an international women's movement of activists, advocates, and advisors to the nations of the world. The Clinton administration set up the President's Interagency Council on Women, a federal entity composed of high-level representatives from 30 federal agencies, whose mission is to implement the commitments under a document called Bring Beijing Home. Bella Abzug boasts that work is underway to promote her platform in high schools, colleges, and universities. And Congress and the American people never had the chance to vote on any part of it.
The most revealing thing about the 3 UN conferences that I have attended is that they have a very set agenda. The United Nations is trying to impose its ideas on the rest of the world. But how are they going to pay for it? I attended a press conference by the World Bank when I was in Rome, and it was very clear that they plan to implement many of the ideas coming to consensus at these different conferences. And who is the biggest funder of the World Bank? The United States is.
The global conference that had the least media coverage in the United States was the UN World Summit for Social Development held in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1995. That's where UN officials worked for consensus on a really extraordinary plan to finance their goals for global governance.
At Copenhagen, James Gustav Speth, a Clinton-appointed UN official, called for a global tax on foreign exchange transactions. This plan would give the UN a steady flow of trillions of US dollars without any action by Congress. Michael Schwartz attended the Copenhagen conference.
What he proposed is a tax on international currency transfers and a tax on international travel, which would be collected by the central banks that did the international currency transfers. So nobody would notice that they were being taxed. But in fact, given especially the high level of international trade that exists today and the high level of international travel, it was estimated at Copenhagen that this would bring in $1.5 trillion a year to the United Nations.
The move to give the United Nations power to impose taxes has the support of several wealthy liberal foundations, such as the MacArthur and Carnegie Foundations. The World Federalist Association, headed by former presidential candidate John B. Anderson, has called for UN taxes on international travel and postal service. Of course, U.S. taxpayers are already paying more than 1/4 of the UN budget.
You get an organization which literally spends hundreds of millions of dollars on conferences every year, on travel, on publications. I mean, this is an organization that puts out like 160 million publications a year and 2 billion pages. Well, what we have is utter irresponsibility there. And as long as you have a system where a voting majority, I mean, 1% of the money comes from the voting majority, you're not going to have a responsible system.
We're now paying 25% of routine UN activities, 31.2% or something like that of UN peacekeeping activities. I think that most of our constituents believe that we are assessed far more than our fair share of UN routine activities and UN peacekeeping.